All right, everybody. I think we're live. So, woohoo! Great. All right, we can go ahead and close that out. Leave. Always love how it asks me, "Are you sure you want to?" Yeah. All right. Let's go to full screen mode with that. So we'll have a little bit here as we start to switch around and do stuff. Hey, Jessica, can you also join the live stream and watch for chats? Any sort of chat stuff? You got that? Awesome. All right, sounds great. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because nobody really wants to see a picture of me up there, plus me right here. Seems a bit much. Yeah, right. Shared my entire screen. All right. And okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and kick these slides off really quick. All right, so welcome to Rocky Mountain Angular. Thanks for coming out. Really glad to have you here. Wow, I did not expect to see you. Welcome here. Great to see you, man. How was New York? Awesome. Awesome. All right, so welcome to Rocky Mountain Angular. Thanks for coming out. This is our first time we've been down here at Slalom Consulting, so I want to give another big shout out and thank you to Slalom for hosting this down here at this location, in this beautiful building, in this great space. So everybody, maybe put your hands together a little bit for Slalom Consulting for hosting us. Thank you very much. And the pizza and the beer and all that. So great. Actually, now I don't need this chair. So I thought I was going to have to sit down and talk to the screen a little bit. So who has heard about Angular Denver? A few of you? All right. Who's bought a ticket for Angular Denver? A few of you? All right, great. So interesting thing here, just to kind of give you a little bit of history of what's been going on. We did an event back in January called an Evening of Angular. So we brought out Joe Eames and Aaron Frost, and they came out and spoke, and we had a great time and went really, really well. I think about 150 people or so showed up. We did the same thing again with Dan Walleen and Chuck Wood in April, and that turned out equally as great, and we really enjoyed having them in town. So what happened when it came to July, we had, I think, 8 speakers that were all really excited to come to Denver all at the same time. And I'm trying to figure this out, going like, well, actually, we can only do 2. That's it. Actually, that's what Ann was telling me. We can only do 2. And of course, then I said, well, no, that's not true. We could do all 8. In fact, what if we just made it a whole day of Angular? And so that's where we decided to go ahead and do a one-day conference called Angular Denver. And then we're also doing a couple of workshops with it. So if you haven't gotten tickets, you just missed the early bird pricing. I think that finished on Friday. Or Saturday is when the rates went up, but the tickets to go to the conference are only $100. Okay, and I'll tell you that the food alone is $65. Okay, for the hotel. So you do the math plus the audio and some other stuff. We're not doing this to make any money, and at the end of it, what the goal is to be able to generate enough funds from this that we can go ahead and make a donation to a local charity that works with kids and technology and makes a difference here in Denver. So that is our goal. In a combination between the workshops and the conference, we're confident that we should be able to raise at least $10,000 for a local charity. And we're going to basically have them come to the conference unsuspecting. And at the end of it, at the end of the night, we're going to give them a check. So I'm really excited to be able to kind of prank them. Not prank them because it's really real money, but really surprise them, right, with this. So we've got, let's see here. We've got 5 full-day workshops. I am doing an Angular Fundamentals class for 2 days. This is the only one that's a 2-day class. And why are we doing it 2 days? Because it has to be 2 days long. There's a lot of information to go over. We've got Joe Eames coming out, and he's doing one on unit testing Angular like a boss. He did the same talk at NGConf. And for you to go to NGConf and do this, you have to pay for airfare, you have to pay for hotel. I think you have to have a ticket to the conference as well, and then on top of it, it's $500 to do this class. So he's coming out. You can get the class right now for $300. I have actually sat in the class. I was an assistant to his class this past NGConf, and it was amazing. So who knows who Sam Julian is? Anybody familiar with him? Got one hand. So he actually wrote an upgrade guide on doing NG upgrade. That the Google team, the Angular team came back and said, wow, this is the definitive guide for how to do Angular upgrades from AngularJS to Angular. So if you have applications that you're thinking about, hey, how do I make this transition? Not a, hey, I'm going to have to dump it all and then rewrite it all to make it, but I want to actually go through the NG upgrade path. He is an amazing speaker. He's got an amazing class, and he's going to walk you through this. His class, if you purchase it just online, I think is like $400 or $500. You can get that one for $300. It's a one-day class, and it should be amazing. And we also have our own Brian Love, who's going to come in and talk about NGRX, and it's going to be an all-day workshop on NGRX to help people go from zero to hero in NGRX. So that all kind of leads into the next thing here is about what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about NGRX. So the first thing I want to know is, like, who's using NGRX right now in a production application? All right, a few of you. All right. Who's using NGRX and hoping to go to production? Yeah, those who got. I love that. It's pointing to the outside, right on. And who wants to use NGRX? All right, all right. And who won't raise their hand no matter what I say? Couple, yeah, couple, yeah. You can point to those people, right? I think it's kind of a trick question if you caught all that. All right, so I'm actually going to stop this one here and exit. We don't need that anymore. So you can go get your tickets if you go out to angulardenver.com. The conference, like I said, is $100. That price will remain, I think, for about a month. And then the pricing will continue to go up. There's also an experience that we haven't really broadcast a lot, but there is an opportunity for you to buy a VIP ticket. And this VIP ticket gets you more than just going to the conference. So after the conference is over, we're actually going to go up to Summit County. We're going to have, I'm not sure if we're going to do one large VRBO or Airbnb sort of thing, or if we're going to end up doing individual rooms at something like the Grand Lodge up at Breckenridge. And we're going to spend Saturday night there. We're going to go up there and we're going to do a bunch of activities, dinner. It's an opportunity to hang out with the speakers that are coming in to Denver. So actually, I didn't even cover the speakers very well, did I? No. All right. So name a few. Joe Eames is going to be there, obviously, since he's coming in for the workshop. We've got Mike Ryan. Does anybody know who Mike Ryan is from the NGRX team? So he's one of the maintainers of NGRX. He has family here. So he's a really great guy, super excited to come back here to Colorado and see family and come speak. Sam Julian is coming out and speaking. We've got Keith Stewart with Samantha. They'll do a really great tag team sort of talk. We got Chris from Scotch.io with Otto. With Otto from Auth0. They've got a really cool presentation about one guy that really cares about performance, the other guy who could really care less, and it's kind of this dueling thing going on, and really an opportunity to look and see, like, what are a lot of people doing that are causing the problems, and what are the things that we can do to fix it. So those are just to name a few of the speakers that are going to be there. For $100, it's a tremendous value. Like I said, for all the workshops are, at this point, they're $300 a piece. If you want to do the 2-day Angular one, you can do just day 1 or just day 2, but there'd be a combined of $600 then at this point. But those will be going up also in about a month. So, all right, so for tonight, we're going to talk about Redux. We're going to talk about NGRX in specific, and we're going to talk about modeling state. So just kind of give you a little story. Why is this important? Why should you even be here? And I'll tell you that the number one reason you want to be here is because you really need to plan out how you're modeling your state. When people start to make decisions about how they're going to model and store their state in their applications, they're making some really critical mistakes that are causing problems. Now, the beautiful thing is this, like most applications, they don't cause problems right away. No, they're fine. Everything's working great. And then as we get closer and closer to the production release, that's, of course, when the problems decide to come out. They're like little Minahoonies. Do you guys know what Minahoonies are? No? Nobody? So in Hawaii, there's this concept of Minahoonies, and they're like these little mythical creatures that come out and they mess everything up during the night so that when we wake up in the morning, everything's just torched. So that's the minute hoonies. And so that's kind of what happens here. As we get closer to production, the minute hoonies come out and start to create a lot of problems that make it almost impossible for us to get to production. So I guess I can hide that. I don't really need to know that we're going to be sharing the screen here. Let's get rid of that. So what data should be kept in the Redux state? This is a really good question. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of debate, like, hey, you should put this into state, you should put this into state, or no, don't do that though. And so it's kind of a big debate about this, but it actually comes down to pretty simple if you follow some basic rules of thumb here about what you should be storing. So first, when we talk about data that's shared between different parts of the application, so this might be authentication tokens, it might be roles, it might be configuration, app configuration that's specific to you or the group that you're part of. Any sort of data that would be shared. It could be, you think about it like a dashboard component. It could have products being displayed 5 different ways, all on one page. That's being reused. And often what I see is people will think that they're creating this really awesome, hey, we're gonna pass around the observable to be able to share this data. And what happens is it actually ends up being a cold observable, I believe. And then so it actually makes 6 different calls to go get the data 6 different times. Even though I'm sharing it, I thought I'd only be hitting it once. So there's little problems like that occur as well. So that's the second part of data that's used by multiple components. So we have components on a page sharing data. You think, well, how often does this happen? Well, let's just take a really simple example that we're all familiar with, Tour of Heroes. So we think about Tour of Heroes. One, we have a list of heroes going down the page, and then we have our top 4 heroes. Well, what happens is a lot of times people will go ahead and they'll make 2 different calls. Hey, I'll go get my top 4 heroes, excellent. And then I'll make another call to go get the heroes again, where actually all we needed to do was dispatch to get the heroes once and use 2 different selectors and get the same data from the store, but we're slicing it slightly different. You guys get the joke there, slicing. All right, forget it. So anytime, another indicator is anytime we need new data that needs to be derived from the original data. So again, we're slicing down to, hey, I just want the top 4. I might want to sort it differently. I might want to group it by something or filter it by some other means, date range or whatnot. So, and then the other thing that you consider of what you put into the store is any state that needs to be restored at a given point in time. So if we need that data to be restored later, that's probably a good candidate that we'd want to go ahead and put that in there. Data that needs to be cached. So what's really nice about using NGRX is that the selectors are memoized. And you go, okay, that's cool word. What does that actually really mean for me? Well, it means that once it goes ahead and calculates out the value for what that selector is supposed to return, unless the underlying data has changed, it's not going to go recalculate. It's just going to go, hey, here you go. And so since selectors are composable, that means if you have 5 different layers of selectors that go into getting your final piece, and then you also sometimes use sub-selectors and other selectors, the ones that have been already pre-calculated and the data hasn't changed, those are all automatically just served right up. We don't have to make those new calculations. The other thing that's not in the slides here that I want you to think about is when we think about time travel in Redux, the ability to go from state to state to state, then we need to have the ability to get all the data that we need without going back out to the store, or I'm sorry, without going back to the API to go get it. So in this case here, what we need is we need to store anything for the UI to be able to recreate that page. So it's the data, it's some of the application data, it's some of the UI state data. So we talk about types of data. There are generally 3 types that we can broadly kind of categorize things into. And I'm kind of giving some of this away here as I talk before I get to the next slide. One is domain data, or what we call entity data. So these are customers, products, orders, list items, you name it, right? This is the entity data that we're typically loading from an API and that we need to store that off. So one common thing that I see people do is that they'll go ahead and they'll just start putting stuff into the store, and they'll just keep putting stuff into the store. And eventually what happens is we have so much data in the store that we basically implode the client-side browser. This is not your database. This is not your database to store everything that, hey, I'm going to bring 5 megs of data down or 5 gigs of data down and store it off into my store. That's a really bad strategy, and your users probably aren't going to have a really amazing experience when they use your application. Really what you want to store is the minimal amount of data so you can recreate that screen. If they were to re-enter, let's say if they were to refresh the entire page, that they'd be able to recreate that instantly, bam. And when I time travel, I go to the next state, okay, now I get my state changes, now I can recreate that page exactly as it was before. So the other one here, so domain data, this is specifically data that the application needs to show, use, or modify. And again, this is the example. Here's a list of to-do items. Anything fetched from the server that we're needing to render. Application state. This is data that is specific to the application's behavior. In most cases, where we start to talk about application data, where most people can identify is, hey, who's the user? What are their roles? What is their token, their authorization token? That's application data that we want to go ahead and store off and make available at a later time. Also here, in case if we had certain items, to-do items 5 and 8 are selected, that's application data. It doesn't have anything to really do with how the state is going to be rendered. So another one here is the request to fetch the to-do list. It's in progress, so we set a loading flag. That, hey, we're loading to-dos. This is application state. What is the state of the application as it exists right now? So the other one is UI state. This one's a little less common. I mean, it depends on your application and what kind of stuff you're using. If you're using a lot of slide outs and whatnot, then you might want to use, have more stuff that you put in the UI state. So it's data that represents how the UI is currently displayed, and it could be that, hey, I've hidden the top nav. I've also minimized the footer. I have a slide out. I've got a modal that has been exposed. So this is any sort of data that we want to store about the specific UI state. So those are really our 3 different types of data that we'd want to store. So then it comes down to how we want to organize the data in the store. So we want to avoid defining the state shape in terms of your UI component tree. So what I mean by that is, I think we have it. No, we don't have the example there. So we want to define the state shape in terms of domain data in the application state, not in terms of saying, okay, so I'm going to create a store called UI sidebar, and then I'm going to put then customer data inside of that, and then some app UI data or application state data in there as well. We don't want to do that. We don't really want to nest a whole bunch of stuff. We don't want to define it in terms of the actual, like, what's going on in the UI. We want to store what's going on in the UI, but we don't want to then make that be part of the actual structure of how we're trying to save it. Because the to-dos don't really belong to the sidebar, even though they might be displayed in the sidebar. Because what you think about today is, like, okay, I want to-dos in the sidebar. That's the only place we're ever going to do it. But then inevitably what's going to happen is the manager's going to come along and go like, no, hey, that's really nice, but we'd like to-dos on the dashboard too. Now what do I do? Now I got to go refactor. I got to go clean some stuff up. So here's really the idea of what we want to see people do in terms of what kind of data we store and how we store it, organizing it. You see here I've got domain data 1, domain data 2. I got my app state 1, app state 2. And then I might have something for UI that's saying, okay, UI sidebar. I want, it's expanded, it's collapsed, it's partial, whatever those different states are that I need to be able to support. All right, so normalizing the data. This is probably one of the trickiest things for most people, because JSON is beautiful, man. Like, I can take it and I can have orders with customers joined together and products, list of products for it. Everything's great. And it makes it really easy to work with when I go to render my UI. I can just enumerate over my orders and then say, yeah, hey, for this order, give me the list of products and who's the customer. And it makes my life really, really simple. And so like here in my example, I'm doing blog posts. So I'm like, all right, I've got my ID, my author, That's got a user in it right there. That points to a user. That's cool. I got my body, and I got comments for this blog post, and that has an author, and then it has the comment. And so you think about when I go to render this, this is really nice. This is really simple to work with. Again, this is before the Minahunis like strike in the middle of the night and show you really the fallacy in this logic. So this data structure is complex, and the data is repeated. So what you might not notice here is I've got user 1, user 2, user 3, user 1. So what happens when I go update user 1 and I actually fix the misspelling of user 1's name? Any guesses?
Basically, I have to repeat the whole thing.
I got to do it twice. I got to go, well, so what's beautiful is this. I got to go find all the places I know about. But I don't know about all the places you put it too, and you. Like as a team, and it just makes our life really very difficult. Now I got to go figure out all the different places that we've attached user data within our store. What does that do to our reducer? It makes it incredibly complex. I now no longer have the beauty of a one-line reducer. I now am the proud owner of a 50 to 100 line reducer. That is very difficult to test, and it's a huge challenge. And this is only the Captain Obvious issue that comes up. So it's very difficult to update, as we talked about. Nested data increases the complexity of the reducer implementation. So much so in the demo code that I'm going to show you here, I didn't even realize it, but I started mutating my data accidentally. All I was trying to do was update a single nested object and try to get it right. And I started mutating. And then here's the great part. Before I went to go do this, this talk at a national conference, I think it was about 8 hours before I realized, finally, after working on this to finalize it, up to it, with less than 8 hours to go, I realized all of a sudden I mutated and I didn't know what to do. So I left it. Why did I leave it? Well, really the real answer is because if I can do it, having been a developer for the last 20, 25 years, how easy is it going to be for everybody else? It's going to be fairly common. And so I think there's a bigger lesson than me just fixing it. And so I want to show you like how easy it is. So we'll take a look at that. Here's the thing that you might not think about: unnecessary rendering. So let's say we don't mess things up. It's possible. And we don't mess it up, and we go ahead and we go ahead update this property that's nested, let's say like 6, 7 levels deep. Let's make it fun, right? Now I've got a really nice component tree because I'm a really great developer. Okay, I'm doing container presentation models, right? And then I got it. It's, you know, the order, then it has the line items, which then has the product piece, which then has this other thing attached to it. So I've got all this nice object hierarchy. My components are really like, when I say object hierarchy, I really mean component hierarchy, right? How I'm rendering this out. And all my components are super, super simple. But what happens when I change that one property down at the bottom of the deal? It forces all of it to re-render. Now this might not be that big of a deal, but in most cases it is. And then we start to come into new problems. This is where those Minahunis start coming out. We're wondering why we're starting to see some really bizarre errors. Who's ever gotten the values changed since last checked error? Yeah, isn't that, I love that one because it tells me right where it's at, right? No, it doesn't tell me anything. And on top of it, I didn't touch anything. I didn't do anything. All of a sudden, it just fires off. And I'm like, half the time it's because when the form's loading. And I haven't even began to make any changes. So we want to avoid this. We want to avoid any unnecessary rendering as our object or as our component hierarchies get more complicated. This can be a very big performance issue. Let alone, you know, the last one that we didn't even put in there is just having to go update that and find that data in all the different places. All right, so before we get into the how are we going to fix this? How are we going to do this? Do you guys want to take a look at a little bit of code here and kind of see what the initial look like? All right, great. All right, not that screen. That one, that's the space continuum sort of thing, vector. I don't know what that is. All right, so let's get this out of the way for right now. All right, so here I've got a nice little reducer. you can see it's a standard reducer, and you know this because I'm using arrays. Okay, and you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, because what we're going to show you on the how in a minute, you won't be using arrays anymore. We'll be using dictionaries. We'll be changing up how our approach is. And so you can see here, though, when I have my load success come in, I am returning my state. So I'm spreading my state, and then I'm spreading my payload, and I'm combining what the old state was with the new payload of data that comes in. Fantastic. We're golden, right? But here's the whole add comment. I think this is all it was. All I'm trying to do is just add a comment and get it to update and work. So in this case here, I'm mapping over the post. If the post ID equals my action ID, then I'm going to take my post comments, and it's going to equal a post comments map. So I'm creating really a new one here, right? And getting my comments and returning the list of comments, and at the end of it, I'm just going to concat my new comment onto the end of it. So I'm like, oh, that seems fairly simple. I'm just going to loop over it, kind of map them into a new array and whatnot. Don't judge my code. This is so this is causing it to mutate. And the beautiful part when it mutates, it doesn't tell you what action mutated it. It actually just updates every single instance of that state for posts, and all of them now have the updated data. So when I go to look to try to find it really quickly, which one is okay? Where is that? It's got my new comment added to it. It's kind of a mess. So outside of that, I've got a fairly well designed piece here. We've got actions. So this is using export const. I would change those to enums if we really want to kind of start to get more up to date with what the patterns are in Redux. I would go ahead and create an action type enum for this. But then I've got all my action classes. Those look pretty standard. Really no change there. And at the bottom here, I've got my union type of all my different action classes. So that's all pretty standard. When we look at our container, there's really nothing magical here. This looks pretty standard. I've got a public variable here of observable type post array called posts. I like to go ahead and put a $sign after it so I know which ones are observables and which ones aren't. That especially comes into play when we're starting to deal with forms and sending data back up to the parent container. But here you can see on my constructor, I'm going ahead and setting my posts observable to equal store select on posts. And then I'm dispatching here on my init to go ahead and go load the post. So nothing too complicated there. And on my components over here, I've got my post component. So this is my child presentation component. His only job is to go ahead and render data, make it look really nice. And if somebody clicks on something, I might output an embedded event up the chain, back out. But otherwise, I'm just getting my data here. This is actually a big no-no. That code does not belong there. Presentation components don't know anything about stores. They don't know anything about services. They just get data handed back down to them. In the case where we'd want to do any sort of update or whatnot, we'd go ahead and emit that back up to the container component. All right, so outside of that, we've got our container, our components, our presentation components. We got our effects over here, pretty standard, nothing too complicated there. So great. So really the main thing to notice here is that this right here is a really nasty mess of code. Because our reducer should really be a single line of code to go ahead and update the state. Now, it might actually be spread over a couple of lines, but it could be actually executed on a single line. We're going ahead and spreading the state, and like what we're doing here. Then spreading the action payload and then combining those into a new array. That's how simple your reducer should be. So when you see code like this, it starts on line 25 and goes down to 33 there, that should be an indicator for you. I have something wrong. Your reducer should not be complex. If it takes you a little more effort to start testing your reducer, whether you're writing them with Jasmine or Jest or whatnot, and they're not really simple, it's a good indicator that you've got a problem. So great, I'm telling you don't do this, so tell me how, right? Because it's one thing to go, hey, don't do it, but what's our alternative? How should we approach this? Well, I want you to think about the data that you're putting in the store is your database. It is your database so that you can recreate the UI exactly as it's supposed to be in that state. So I can time travel from the loading state to the loaded state to the next state and so on and so forth, okay? So if we treat it like a database, each type of data gets its own table. We no longer try to nest data and create relationships that way. We already know it's going to cause us problems. Our reducer is going to be complex, unnecessary rendering. It's just in general not a good practice. And by the way, this is not a thing that's unique to Angular. This is not anything that's unique to NGRX. This technique is actually described by the reduxjs.org and for their spec on normalizing client-side data. NGRX did a slightly different implementation, but honestly, it's almost identical to what that recommendation was. So if each type of data gets its own table, instead of having any sort of nesting, we treat them as first-class citizens within our store. So now we go back to what we did before. We had our posts, and inside there we had comments, and inside of there we had users appended. All that goes away. Now we're actually doing posts, comments, users, all first-class stores or within the store, right? So each a separate little mini database of the data that we need to be able to render. Great, so each table is an object, and for each item, the item ID is the key and the value is the item. So what's that actually describing? It's describing a dictionary. So our APIs typically, when we're dealing with groups of data, we're dealing with arrays. And arrays are great. It's what we're used to dealing with, and it's way better than XML, right? Can we all agree? Like, XML was not a lot of fun. And if you're still working with XML, I'm sorry, but yeah, it's tough. So what we want to do is get away from arrays, because when we go back over here and we lay our data out like this, arrays aren't really good for creating relationships. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that if I have a post and I want to find who the user is that was the author, I would then have to go do a search to find, using the user store, I'd have to go do a search and find that user, and then be able to display their information. So who's the author for this? And I have to do the same for comments. Now, that's not that big of a deal if I'm displaying one post with a couple of comments. But what if I'm displaying one post with 5,000 comments? What kind of performance can I expect from this? I can tell you it will be lousy. It will not perform well. It's not a pretty task to go do. So there's got to be a better way. So that really comes down to dictionaries. So with dictionaries, what we're doing is we're taking our array-based data and now we're converting it over to a dictionary where my ID, whatever my unique identifier is, that becomes my key. So we're just talking about key value pairs here for a dictionary. So my key is whatever my unique identifier is, and my value is my full object. Okay, so now if I want to find the user or the author that has a user ID of 55, okay, great. I get the users from the store, and I say, square brackets, give me 55, and it instantly pulls it right out of there. There is no filtering, no searching, no finding, nothing. It's just instant. I can find my data. Now I can start to create relationships using selectors. And I can match up my data very, very quickly. So how does this actually work? Well, the way to implement this is that we go ahead and create our store called posts. And inside of there, we create a property called entities. Notice there's no array data here. We're not dealing with any sort of arrays at this point, but I've got an entities property, and inside of there, post 1 is its ID, and then I'd have all the information for post 1 for that object. Post 2 is an ID, and then it would have its object. Okay, cool, great. The one problem about a dictionary is well, how do I maintain the order? Because the order of the data that it came down, it might be sorted. It might be prioritized, and we need to maintain that. So we take the item order, and it's stored in an array containing the item IDs, and it's just simply called IDs. So it is either a string or number array, and that stores our natural order. So when we go to rebuild our data and get it, because here's the problem. When dictionary data is great for creating relationships, but when I'm actually ready to render it, Rendering and doing an NG4 across a dictionary doesn't work. It's not enumerable. I'm not able to iterate over this and then be able to display. And then plus the IDs aren't really in the natural order of how I want them anyway. You know, so it's just going to kind of randomly put data into it based off of what the key order is, not the order of what we want for the data. So by storing the IDs off into the array, then we can enumerate over those and then pick each data element off the dictionary and return those as a new array. Great, so this sounds really easy, right? You should be able to do this. I mean, it shouldn't take a whole lot of code to go ahead and bring this all together. So now every time you do a load, I need you to go ahead and create an entities deal, and then I need you to map your object, enumerate over it, the array, and go, no. This would be a nightmare, right? Imagine if you had to do this for 100 different entities to bring this all together. So there's actually a library for this. It's called NGRX Entity, and it does all the heavy lifting for you. You don't have to sit there and map things back and forth. It has a default set of selectors for you that will help you get data in and out. Or actually, really back selectors are for getting data out. The adapter will help you get the data in and get it into the format that you want. So the real reason for using this library is that these related items are referenced by ID. We're able to quickly create relationships. We're able to quickly find the data. There's no looping, none of this stuff. Now what we're doing is we're storing things by key. So where before we had our post and I had an author, which was another object, right? Now or I have user ID of 1, it's got the name and the user ID and all that on it. But now when I go to render this and I want the author, you can see I go get the post, I go get the user, I'm able to match those up really, really quickly. So NGRX Entity really comes to save the day. Now what's great about this is when I originally gave this talk back in October, it was not even released yet. And luckily about 10 days later, it did get released, and I was really happy about that. And then, so the NGRX team wrote this. I had no part of it, by the way. I just saw what was going on and realized that this is a really powerful mechanism for us to fix some of the problems we're seeing with our nested data and how do we manage these relationships. So with this, the adapter is really your big gun here. It's the one that does all the work. So instead of having to try to figure out the entities and mapping things to dictionaries and maintaining that order of IDs. Now imagine this, what if you actually need them to be sorted in a particular order so that all the entities were put in by last name? Okay, that was a sort order. Could you imagine trying to have to sit there and maintain and figure out, crud, we're inserting a record here and their name is something right in the middle of the dictionary, like their last name is Lima. Right, and you're like, okay, well, where do I start? How do I insert this in there? It does all this for us. We don't have to do any of it. And we'll go ahead and find the right spot to insert that record into and maintain that order for us. So the adapter provides methods performing operations against our store. Okay, so basically it gives us, I believe it's like 7 methods here. So it allows us to add, remove, and update our store. With a single call to the command, we give it the old state, what our payload is, and then it's going to do all this for us underneath the covers. So here are those instant methods. We have add one, add many, add all. Where people mostly get confused here is between add many and add all. Add many basically appends to what's already there, where add all takes what's ever there and wipes it out, and now we're inserting new data. So it can be a little bit confusing because people will go ahead and do an operation like this and they'll start to see the data doubling up and doubling up and doubling up, and all of a sudden they're like, I have 5 copies of everything. Well, why? Well, it's typically because you're using add many versus add all. You also have remove methods here. You've got your updates, same basic sort of concepts there as well. All right, so we talk about the adapters. There's a couple things that we need to do to get it set up. One is we need to talk about what the entity state looks like. And so entity state is an interface here. We're going to implement this interface. And as you can see, it's got an IDs property and it's got an entities property. Now this really kind of crazy Okay, entities is an object, but it's got a property declaration, ID colon string, and then it's using the generic type coming in. That's a dictionary definition. Okay, basically it's just saying that the ID is a key, and then it's going to point to this type. Okay, and whatever type that we pass in. So we're going to create a model. We're going to pass it into the entity state, like an object or an order or a post, and then it's going to go ahead and create this typed entity dictionary for us. And then it's got our IDs list here. Now, if we're numeric, it'll change it over to a number array. Otherwise, it'll be a string array. So here we have a model. We've got our interface user. It's really simple. It's got an ID and a name. And then we're going to go ahead and use that entity state interface that we just talked about. So here we're going to export a new interface called state. It's going to extend entity state of type user. Okay, so now it tells it, hey, it's going to be of type user. It's going to look and say, hey, based on the fact that we have an ID, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to, my IDs is going to be of type string. And then I'm also adding an additional property here. So this is where things get a little bit muddled from what I told you earlier. So I told you that if you have UI state or application state, and this is really application state, that you'd want to put that into its own store. But the entity, NGRX Entity, gives you the ability to add some additional state properties that might make sense for you to go ahead and put them a little bit closer to the action, if you will. So think about this. If you had 6 different entities all loading, you'd have to have a orders loading, products or loading, all these different properties that you'd then have to go get selectors on and go check and find, and it can be a little bit difficult. Same thing with do we have an error? Is it an error with products? Or is it an error with posts? Is it an error with orders? Where was the error actually at if we're displaying multiple components? So instead of having to have those be out into their own application state store, this allows us to go ahead and define some properties that are very custom to this entity. So the 3 that I most commonly see is that we'll have a selected ID, we'll have a loading flag, and we'll have an error flag. And in that way, we can watch for those and know that the error that they're experiencing is for posts. It's not for users. It's not for comments. And I can then make my UI much more robust and dynamic and display the appropriate error in the appropriate spot versus having to try to work with a more generic sense, or having to parse lots of different types of errors, different types of loading flags there. So in this case here, we got a selected user ID. So this creates our state for our reducer here. So then we get to our entity adapter. And this really, we're pulling in 2 different types here. One is, well, actually a type and a method. We have a type for entity adapter. And we're then going to use this function called create entity adapter, and we're going to give it our user. Okay, so that is our model. We're also passing to the entity adapter. This is what creates our adapter for us. And now once we have this, we can then begin to use our adapter to make those calls that I showed you earlier about add one, add many, add all, those sorts of things that we can start to add to our state. All right, so that all said, that's actually really most of it. The other thing that we're going to do is we're going to create an initial state, but we'll take a look at that when we get into the sample code. So selectors, we've been talking about selectors a little bit, and I've kind of given you a few of the pieces on this, so we'll breeze through this pretty quickly. If the store is like a database, then your selectors are like queries. These are how you get the data back out, and really how you're going to make your application super efficient. So you're no longer going to have to go out and make multiple loads to go get data. A lot of times that data can be shared across multiple components, and we can use selectors to filter it down or change how it's displayed. You know, we can roll it up, we can reduce some of the fields, we can combine fields, whatever we want to do there. And we can do that just using selectors. So selectors are actually part of the NGRX store. You have 2 basic methods. One is create selector, and the other was create feature selector. The create feature selector is how we get to the actual store instance very easily. You could do the same with create selector, just feature selector makes it 1 step less. So here what we have is, let me just, what do we have on the other side here? So we're pulling from NGRX store. We're getting create selector, create feature selector. We've got our, and in this case, this is a really simple example. We have an interface called feature state that just has a single property called counter. The app state points to the feature state, and then here I'm creating a property that will just go ahead and select that feature, which then I could ask it for the counter. So this is, to me, not a great example, but it shows you some of the base pieces of how I use that state to go get a property off of it. We'll take a look at a couple other better examples of selectors and how we build those and compose them. But the powerful thing about selectors is when we're going to select the data, we don't have to create the one selector, the mother of all, that will do everything. We can actually break it down into smaller steps, and then our selectors are composable. So in this case here, I'm creating a selector called select feature count, and so I'm taking that feature, the selector we created on the last slide, select feature, and I'm taking the state that comes back from that, and I'm using a big arrow function to then grab the counter off of that. So you can see that's composable. I can actually take the other selector that was very simple, combine it with this one to get my feature state, and then from there, from the feature state, I can ask it for the specific value that I'm looking for. So this is really common for when I'm trying to get stuff off the state, like loading, errors, selected ID, those sorts of things. All right, so let's take a look at how I might compute some data. I'm going to go ahead and create a select items selector here. It's going to take state and return state items, and then I've got to select total. That's now going to take and use the create selector method using select items. That's basically getting my state, then my items. So if you look here, that's actually, here's my state, and I've done it. So that first one is actually going to return my items array that we have right here. Okay. And then from there, I'm going to take those items, and I'm using a big arrow function, and I'm going to reduce them using an accumulator in that item, and I'm going to go ahead and bring the item value and add that to the accumulator, starting with a default value of 0. So what that's going to do is at the end here is I'm going to get a value of $2.15. So I have a really nice, simple, composable selector that's calculating values for me. All right. Let's talk about using the selector with the store itself, because this probably will help bring this all together a little bit better for you. And then we'll jump into some code here and look at the actual examples and see the selectors really live and how we use them. Maybe we'll add another selector and see how we would go ahead and be able to get those values off. So in our case here, I've got a constructor. I'm bringing the store in, and I'm calling the store select on select total. So that would actually go get me that total. I would go ahead and import select total in from the selectors file. Usually lives in the index. And I would go ahead and get that select total selector, and now this dot total would equal that. It's technically an observable of that number. So it's easy as that to be able to get those values back out of the store. All right, so here's where we're going to go dig into some code and try to bring this all home for you. We're going to switch here, check out refactor. Well, of course, I've got local changes. Hit stash, hit checkout refactor. All right, great. So let's see here. It takes a second to kind of get caught up. I'm going to move this out of the way. Is that actually big enough for you guys to see in the back? Should we make it just a little bigger, you think? Little, good, good. I got old eyes, man, so I can't see anything. You see it? You good? All right. All right, so you see here, this is our reducer. We're going to walk down through our reducer and take a look at what's going on here. And we'll actually look at how we'd expand this a little bit more. Let's get this out of the way as well. So when I'm creating my reducer, I'm pulling an entity state, entity adapter, and create entity adapter. These are the three things we've already looked at during the slides. I'm pulling in my post and my user. I'm pulling in my post actions and my post action types. So here I've got my app state. We're not too concerned with this right now. This is actually used for later. But here I'm creating my post state, and it's extending my entity state, passing to the type post. Again, so this is now creating my post state, describing what does my post support. So I'm feeding it my post model, but I want to go ahead and extend it. So I've got my selected post ID, which is either going to be a number or it's going to be null. But let's say, just for grins here, I want to have a loading of type Boolean, and I want to have a error of type string, just in case I wanted to be able to report something back. And now here I go ahead and create my adapter. I'm using the entity adapter as my type, passing it the post, and then I'm using the create entity adapter, passing it the post. And here I'm doing something a little different. We didn't really talk about this earlier. We kind of briefly touched on it, but I wanted to leave this in here so you could see it. What if my post doesn't have a property called ID? I need to be able to map it to something. So in this case here, let's say it was called post ID, then all I'd have to do is just change it like that. And it would then go, okay, that is what we're using for the selected ID. I can extrapolate the type from that, infer that, and now we know that it's type string versus type number or whatnot. We'll go ahead and reset that though. The other thing that I can do here, you wouldn't really want to set this to false, because it's already, that's what it's by default. But using sort compare, I can go ahead and add a sorting function to this so that my posts are always sorted by the publish date. Right? So I'd see the latest ones first, and I wouldn't have to worry about always having to do that sort of filtering. The problem with that is then there's a performance hit that you're going to take for that, so you have to kind of weigh that out on whether or not that makes sense. Great. So the next thing we're doing here is we're creating our initial state. So we tell it it's of type post state, which was defined right up here, and then we're using our post adapter to call get initial state, but it's complaining right now. It's actually not valid. And the reason being is we're not telling it what is the valid state for the two new properties that we just added. So I want to set loading to false, and I want to set error to a blank string. So now it actually type checks out. We're all totally good. We're giving it all the values that it's expecting. Great, so now I've got my reducer. The reducer's done the same way. I'm giving it a state, and I'm also giving it an action. It's going to default to the initial state, and it's going to return a post state. So we're switching on our action type, and we're doing the same exact thing. On a load, we're going to go ahead and spread whatever our existing state is. I might actually take this to another level and say, hey, when I call load for posts, what happens if the user looks away? And the posts and it errors out, the growl goes away, and they look back, and there's data there. They're going to assume that nothing went wrong. So what I like to do is say, okay, look, let's take this adapter, and I'm going to say let's not that one. Was it the post adapter? I'm going to go ahead and remove everything that's already in it, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it the state. Great, so I can go ahead and remove everything from it. And the next thing I want to do is I want to overload what loading is set to. It's going to take whatever my state was, remove all the entities out of it, and it's going to return my state now back to me, right? I want to respread that so I can insert it into a new object, but I want to set loading equal to true. And in case there was an error on the prior load, I want to go ahead and set error back to a blank string. Okay? So here on my load success, I'm going to change this from an add mini to an add all because I don't want to have it append to. I want to take whatever data is there and replace it just in case. So I'm giving it whatever the payload is plus whatever the prior state was. Oh, what's the thing that we need to turn off? We need to turn off loading. So now I can come in here and say loading is set to false. And then if we have a fail, I'm just going to go ahead and spread whatever my existing state is. I'm going to set loading to false, and I'm going to set my error to be a very generic error while loading posts. Now, if I weren't using NGRX Entity, I would have to have different, I'd actually have to have other effects that would process those actions, setting loading flags on a different store. I'd be setting errors on a different store, it'd be on some sort of application state. But using NGRX Entity, I can actually really simplify what I'm doing, that I don't have to go off and use a whole bunch of different stores to really just contain the data of what I need right here around my posts. So that's really the biggest change. Notice here, where are the arrays at? They're not here anymore, okay? So can you still use arrays and not use entities? Sure, absolutely. There's nothing that says you can't mix and match these. I often see people, and I'll get lazy and do this myself, where I'll just start declaring it out as an entity, and it's actually just a single item that's going into the store, and so I'm overcomplicating things. Don't do that. Use entities for when we have array-based data that we need to store it in a dictionary so we can do relational stuff with it. If we don't need to do that, then you may not need all of this extra lifting, right? So coming back over here really quick to take a look at our component, you can see it actually is exactly like it was before. We're not doing anything special. Now what I do have, actually if we come back over here to the index, I can get the selected ID. I want to do a couple deals here because the other thing that we didn't make available here is get the error and get loading. So I want to get the state, and I can return back the error. I can return the loading flag here, and then I can create. Let's just do the loading one really quick. Here, did I mess that up? Yep. Okay, there we go. I'm going to get the loading, and I'm going to get select the post state, and then I'm going to use this one I just created for get the loading. Export const get loading. Oh, I have the same thing. So I'm just going to call it loading here. I'm going to get the loading, and then over here on the that one, I'm on the component here. When I go to load the posts, one of the other things I can do is now go ahead and create a loading $, type observable, type Boolean, and now here I can say this dot loading equals this dot store. The new way is actually say pipe and then select. It probably isn't going to pick all this up, but the post selectors dot loading. So I need to get that imported and whatnot. We're kind of running out of time here, but you can see now I can add these additional properties. I can select those very, very quickly. I can now start to work with being able to find by particular ID. So in this case here, I don't think we actually put together an example, but if I wanted to get on my selectors, if I wanted to get a comment, like if I had a comment reducer, I could use that comment reducer to say I need to load comments by the post ID. Now I can grab the post ID from the post store and then say give me all the ones, and I can do a filter just to get all the comments for this given post. Or if the post actually has just the comment IDs with it, I can just enumerate over those and then pick those values up and shove them straight in. Very, very quickly, very easy to do. All right, so that all said, we're running up right at an hour, so I'll take a few questions before we get done. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you go back to your post reducer real quick?
I'm going to go back to the post reducer. All right.
The adapter there. So like there's a post action code, you're doing a spread off the return remove all.
Yep.
Is that the way the adapters work? Is that are they mutating state or they return back?
No, so it actually has nothing to do with the adapter. So what happens here, the adapter will go ahead and return my state back to me. But what I want to do at this point is I want to go ahead and use the spread operator so that I can say, okay, that's great. I'm going to take the state that's returned from the remove all. I'm going to respread that, put it into a new object, and then anything that I add after that line, loading, error, whatever that property might be, is now overriding those values.
So you don't need to spread on the state passed into the
You know, that's a good question. The typical standard, the way we see it, is to go ahead and spread it so that we're putting it into an object. I'm not sure that we can actually return, because we're getting a new state at that point. And now I want to take that new state spread it again so I can then overload these other values. So the risk is if I don't do not realign those to this new object, because it's an object itself.
I just didn't need to spread the state. I need to remove all.
Oh, are you talking about this, putting this state in? This one does not need to be spread because it's going to take it. It's going to take whatever that existing state is, and it's going to return a new state. Yep. Any other questions?
When do you decide to introduce NGRX?
So the rule of thumb on the question is when to decide to introduce NGRX. That's a really good question because we usually see people do it way too early and on applications that are way too simple. It's one thing if you're just going to go at home and you know academically learn this and you're going to do Tour of Heroes with NGRX, but that's not appropriate in a production environment. It's overkill. You don't need it. It's not that complex of an application, and you might want to look at something like I would probably defer to something like services with subjects, so that I could take the data that's being returned, put it into that subject, and we could subscribe. You know, we could get instances of that subject. When it starts to get complex, is really the number one answer. When the application complexity starts to get nasty. So what I see typically is people start shoving data into something called session service, right? It's usually our friend, great, starts out holding a few things about authentication, and before we know it, it's 600 lines long with a really long header warning at the top of it that says "Do not touch." Did I look at your code? I looked at your code. No, I have been guilty of this myself, and I've been caught into this problem, and so it's not uncommon to see this sort of really mega service that starts to create problems. Other indicators. If I have really complex logic, so one of the talks that I'm working on right now is, hey, when do you use NGRX when it doesn't have anything to do with entities at all? So a really good example is this website I was looking at that had tags. It had a list of tags, and depending on, it was showing posts, and depending on in the default mode, it would show you a default list of tags. But then if you selected one of those tags, it would filter the articles, and then we'd have to get a new list of tags that are unique based on the articles that are still showing. And then I could also type to filter for tags on top of that. And so when I opened up this initial page and looked at it, I was like, holy moly, this needs a warning. Don't touch this code. This is like very volatile, very crazy to try to maintain. Trying to like follow it all was just a nightmare. So I was like, all right, well, time out. Let's do this instead. Let's move this over to NGRX. Let's go ahead and create a model. Let's go ahead and create a reducer for the different types of what the filter is. And then I'll have a tags, I'll have my default tags, you know, being listed in the store as well. But then what I can do is based off of what the filter is, I can inspect the filter and say, hey, if we have no filter at all and no tags have been selected, then go ahead and return just the default tags that are already in the store. Cool, really easy selector there. But otherwise, if we have a tag selected, now we need to have a selector that enumerates over the articles and gets all my unique tags there. So I have a separate selector to get unique tags based on articles. See my point here? I was able to reduce the complexity, get it out of the component, and push it down into the selectors where it was very easily tested, it was composable, and very manageable. It still wasn't, you know, like super easy, but it was actually got to the point where it's really manageable and maintainable. And I wasn't worried about if I go in and start making changes, it's going to blow up. So that's typically, if you're not reducing complexity, you're using the wrong tool. Any other questions? Ken?
Talked about changing your action types from constants into enums. What's the advantage there?
The advantage is there, it's a lot easier to pass around. So what I don't like about using constants is that, let's say, well, let's take a look at our reducer here. Typically then, what did I do here? Oh yeah, see, well, these are actually by classes. When I want to go look at types and I want to figure out what type is being used, it's a lot easier to pull in a single value, and then I've got all those in one. Versus this is kind of when I look at Oh, see, this is why, because I did change this one over. This is a lot nicer, cleaner to work with. It's a lot easier to look at. So am I using my types here? Yeah, so I got my post action types dot load. So when I go to create another one, I can see a list of what all my options are. I had a single import up here for my post action types. Instead of, I would have had to load every single constant that I wanted to support in my reducer. All caps is not a real, I'm not a real big fan of. If we're having string types or string constants, we can take those and easily be able to put those into an enumeration, and then we can pass those around, and it just makes life a lot easier. Yep, but it is a preference thing. You could do it either way. There's nothing that says, you know, you're a bad person if you do it the other way. I might say that, but you know, there's nothing that can actually stop you from doing anything with your code that you could do with enumerations. It's really a preference. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you parameterize a selector?
Oh, that is a really good question. Can you parameterize a selector? How do I want to answer this? I would probably ask that or answer that with another question. Can you or should you? You can. There is a hack way of doing it. Selectors do not have parameters. Okay, they're actually using the store, other values from the store. It could be within their own store, or it could be from another store. So you could have comments getting whatever the selected post ID is, so that I can do a selector there and use that post ID within the comments selectors. There is a way to do it. It's not recommended. I'm not really sure what the implications of it are, but it's a bit of a hack. So one of the ways I can do it, so if we come over here to one of my selectors, and I can say, let's just copy this one here. If I can get it to release, selected post ID 2. So I want to get the post date, I want to get the selected ID, and let's just say I wanted to then have another. I'll do this. Actually, no, let's just do this slightly different. All right. It equals, or we'll just call it other ID here. I'm creating a big arrow function. And inside of here, I'm creating a new function that would have the state, the ID, and big arrow, and basically say if other ID is greater than the ID given, or whatever crazy logic I wanted to do there, then return other ID. I just parameterized it.
Does that mean that state gets curried from selected functions?
That's a good question. Does the state get curried? Let me get this to format a little bit better. I'm not sure what's actually happening there. This is basically considered to be a really bad practice, like don't do it. I do see people do this from time to time, but it's really not what the how the selectors work. It also then messes with memoization. You lose the memoization aspect of it, okay? Because now we have a new parameter that we're injecting in, and so it's breaking that chain, if you will. So I'm not sure. I haven't really dug into it too far. I just know it's highly frowned upon, but I do see it from time to time where people hack it to do this. But there's other ways of handling it. So in large part, what we see is people try to enumerate over a list of orders, and then they want to then get the customer ID off the order and then pass that to the selector for the customer, right? To get it by this ID that I'm passing in. But there's actually better ways to handle this than trying to do that, right? And so it's actually one of the things that I do in another talk when we talk about complex forms and how we do complex views and then complex forms and dealing with this relational data. All right. Well, with that, we're about 10 minutes over our time. So this isn't too bad since we took so many great questions. we're going to go ahead and shut down the online part. I want to thank everybody for coming. Anybody online that was able to make it out. This video will also be available online. So it'll be available, I believe, immediately. And, right? But she'll actually go ahead and process all the live feed with the speaker presentation inset. And that'll be out in about a week. That's the other reason that we're doing this, is so we can get these videos out to people a little bit quicker. They'll be available to you, and then we'll go ahead and update them. So with that, again, thanks everybody for coming. I think there's probably still a little bit of beer left. Looks like there's tons of pizza left. Would love to meet each one of you if you have any questions specifically, if you want to get a card from me or whatnot. Really quick, just if you don't know, I'm with a company called BrieBug. I'm the CEO. Mostly what I do is talks just like this, talking around the country, speaking with people about NGRX, and hopefully inspiring them to go out and create some really amazing software. If you like this presentation and you want to learn more, come up and get a business card from me. Would love to hear more about what you're doing. I'm happy to do a little architecture review with you on your project, take a look at what you're doing, the approaches, and give you some hints on, like, hey, you might want to consider this, or you might want to consider that. And just something I do for free within the community to help everybody out. So with that, again, thanks everybody. Hope to talk to you in a minute.